Hey guys, tonight we begin with the forgotten children of Victorian London, the street orphans who turned survival into an art form that would make modern teenagers look like amateur hour. Think you know what it was like being a kid without parents in the 1800s? Think again, because these weren't the tragic waifs from Christmas movies. They were scrappy, cunning little entrepreneurs running the most efficient underground economy, this side of a mafia operation. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Victorian street orphans. Most people picture Oliver Twist, pathetic, starving waifs begging, "Please sir, I want some more," while evil adults exploit them. In reality, these kids were running sophisticated criminal enterprises that would make modern gang leaders take notes. This wasn't some Dickensian tragedy where innocent children suffered in silence. It was Lord of the Flies meets Ocean's 11, set in the world's largest open-air toilet dot. Think of Victorian London as the world's most dangerous daycare center, except the children were armed with wits sharper than broken glass, and the playground was a maze of sewage-filled streets where your survival depended on outsmarting adults who'd sell their own mothers for a pint of gin. These orphans weren't victims waiting for rescue. They were the CEOs of their own tiny empires, complete with hierarchies, territories, and business models that would make Amazon jealous. Picture a 10-year-old running a pickpocketing operation with the efficiency of a modern corporation, complete with training programs, performance reviews, and retirement plans, which usually involved either prison or death. But hey, at least they had options. While middle-class children were learning piano and proper table manners, street orphans were getting master's degrees in human psychology, urban geography, and creative problem solving. They could read a crowd better than any market researcher, navigate the city better than any cab driver, and negotiate better than any lawyer, all while maintaining the innocent face that made adults underestimate them completely. The 1840s through 1880s was London's growth spurt from hell. The city wasn't quaint Victorian elegance. It was a massive construction site populated by desperate people who'd moved from the countryside expecting streets paved with gold, but finding them paved with something far less pleasant. Immigration and industrialization didn't create opportunity. They created the world's largest human traffic jam, where everyone was competing for scraps. Victorian London wasn't gas lamps and gentlemen in top hats. It was 2 million people crammed into a space designed for maybe 500,000, with sanitation systems that would make a medieval peasant gag. The Thames wasn't a romantic river. It was London's largest open sewer, and drinking the water was basically playing Russian roulette with cholera. If you thought modern cities had homeless problems, imagine a place where entire families lived in single rooms, and those were the lucky ones. The workhouses controlled what passed for social services, and their idea of helping orphan children was basically, here's some gruel and 14 hours of mind-numbing labor. Try not to die before you're useful. Church charities existed, but their resources were like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The government's attitude toward homeless children was essentially out of sight, out of mind, which worked great until thousands of these kids decided to make themselves impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the gap between rich and poor wasn't just wide. It was a chasm so vast you could fit entire solar systems in it. Wealthy Victorians lived in a completely different universe, where servants handled every unpleasant reality, and poverty was something that happened to other people, preferably far away. They'd read about social problems in newspapers while sipping tea served by mates who probably lived worse than the street children they were reading about. The legal system treated children as small adults when it came to punishment, but as property when it came to protection. A 10-year-old could be hanged for theft, but couldn't own anything or make any legal decisions. It was like being stuck in the world's worst video game, where all the rules were designed by people who clearly hated children and common sense in equal measure. Meet Sarah Thompson. Though that probably wasn't her real name, since street orphans changed identities more often than modern teenagers change their Instagram usernames. Sarah was 8 years old when we first encounter her in police records from 1847, already running what can only be described as Victorian London's most adorable protection racket. Sarah had discovered that rich ladies shopping in fancy districts had one fatal weakness: they absolutely could not handle the sight of a crying child. So Sarah perfected the art of strategic sobbing, positioning herself outside expensive shops where well-dressed women would emerge, see this tiny girl in tears, and immediately assumed someone terrible had happened, while the lady was distracted, fishing for coins or handkerchiefs. Sarah's younger brother, actually her business partner, Tommy, would be relieving the woman of her purse with the skill of a professional magician. But Sarah was just getting started. She realized that the same wealthy ladies who fell for the crying routine would return the next week, so she developed different characters. The lost little girl looking for her mama, the hungry child who hadn't eaten in days, the sick orphan who just needed medicine. She had more personas than a method actor and more costume changes than a pop star. Tommy would play different roles too. Sometimes he was her dying brother, sometimes her cruel guardian, sometimes just a fellow street child who could vouch for her story. The genius of Sarah's operation was that she never hit the same street 2 days in a row, and she kept detailed mental notes about which ladies had already been approached, and with which story. She had divided London into territories, and had a network of other children who would report which areas had the most profitable marks on any given day. By age 9, she was essentially running a consulting firm for amateur pickpockets, teaching new kids the proper techniques for looking pathetic while maintaining operational efficiency. The authorities eventually caught up with Sarah, but not because she made mistakes, because one of her competitors snitched to eliminate the competition. When they arrested her, she had enough money hidden in various locations to live comfortably for months, plus detailed intelligence about police, patrol patterns, and the personal habits of dozens of wealthy potential victims. The magistrate was so impressed by her organizational skills that he almost seemed disappointed to sentence her to the workhouse. But here's the twist that makes Sarah's story perfect for understanding Victorian street life. She escaped from the workhouse within a week and was back on the streets running an even more sophisticated operation within a month. The workhouse had taught her useful skills like basic literacy and sewing, which she immediately applied to creating more convincing disguises and forging simple documents. The system designed to reform her had accidentally given her an MBA in criminal enterprise. And if you think Sarah was exceptional, wait until you hear about the kids who made her look like an amateur. The streets of Victorian London weren't just producing survivors. They were producing tiny criminal masterminds who would make modern corporate executives look like they lacked imagination. This wasn't just about children being poor or hungry, though they were both, constantly. The stakes were biological survival in an environment specifically designed to kill them. Victorian London had infant mortality rates that would make war zones look safe, and the children who made it past infancy faced diseases, accidents, violence, and legal systems that treated them as disposable nuisances. But the deeper stakes were about what happens when you take children whose brains are naturally designed to learn, adapt, and find creative solutions, and put them in impossible situations. With no adult supervision worth mentioning, these kids weren't just surviving. They were creating an entirely parallel society with its own rules, hierarchies, and cultural norms. They were accidentally conducting the world's largest uncontrolled experiment in child development, and the results were both fascinating and terrifying. The children who thrived on the streets developed skills that no school could teach. They could read human nature like a book, spot opportunity in the most unlikely places, and form alliances and betrayals with the strategic thinking of career politicians. But they also lived with the daily knowledge that a single mistake, a moment of bad luck, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time could mean death, permanent injury, or transportation to the colonies. What made this particularly tragic was that many of these children were incredibly intelligent and resourceful. In different circumstances, they might have become scientists, artists, or leaders. Instead, they were using their considerable talents just to stay alive in a world that viewed them as problems to be solved, rather than human beings to be helped. They were innovating solutions to problems that shouldn't have existed, displaying creativity and intelligence that was being completely wasted on mere survival. The Victorian establishment knew these children existed, but preferred to think of them as a temporary problem that would solve itself through either reform or natural selection. They had no idea they were watching the emergence of an entirely new subculture that would influence criminal enterprise, social movements, and urban survival strategies for generations to come. But Sarah Thompson and her crying child protection racket was just the beginning of London's orphan underground economy. While she was perfecting the art of emotional manipulation, other children were developing completely different survival strategies that would make her techniques look quaint by comparison. Consider the mudlarks, children who spent their days wading through the Thames at low tide, searching for anything valuable in the toxic soup that passed for London's waterfront. Or the pure finders who specialized in collecting dog waste for the leather industry. Yes, that was actually a job. And yes, children competed for the best waste collecting territories. Then there were the climbing boys, the flower sellers, the crossing sweepers, and dozens of other micro-professions that adults had either abandoned as too dangerous or never thought to create in the first place. Each group developed its own culture, its own internal rules, and its own methods for dealing with the various adults who wanted to exploit, reform, or eliminate them. They created a shadow economy so complex and efficient that it operated parallel to legitimate business with minimal interference from law enforcement, who frankly had bigger problems to worrying about. The streets of Victorian London weren't just producing individual success stories like Sarah. They were producing an entire alternative civilization, complete with its own forms of government, justice, education, and social organization. And understanding how that world works requires diving deep into the daily reality of children who learn to turn survival into an art form. The mudlark economy wasn't just Victorian London's most disgusting job. It was the city's first successful recycling program, run entirely by children who'd figured out that one person's garbage was literally another person's treasure. Unlike the romantic notion of plucky orphans making dough with scraps, this was a sophisticated salvage operation that would make modern waste management companies weep with envy. The Thames foreshore at low tide revealed London's daily deposits of human civilization, coins dropped by drunks, jewelry lost by the careless, metal fragments from industry, bones from butcher shops, and approximately 17 different types of human waste that we probably shouldn't catalogue in detail. While adults saw a toxic wasteland, children saw a shopping mall that restocked itself twice daily with the rhythm of the tides. The mudlarks weren't random kids wandering around in the muck. They were specialists who developed techniques for reading the Thames like a financial newspaper. They knew which areas produced the best finds, what times of day offered optimal searching conditions, and how to spot valuable items while avoiding the particularly dangerous debris that could kill them faster than Victorian medicine could say, "We have no idea what's wrong with you." This wasn't desperate scavenging. It was strategic resource extraction. The experienced mudlarks had territories, partnerships, and trading relationships that would make modern commodity brokers jealous. They understood market forces, seasonal variations, and customer demand in ways that most adults never bothered to learn. An 8-year-old mudlark could tell you more about London's economic patterns than most merchants, simply because they were literally sifting through the physical evidence of every transaction in the city. The irony was that, while respectable, society was busy being disgusted by these children, the mudlarks were performing essential economic services. They recovered valuable materials that would otherwise be lost forever. They cleaned the riverfront of debris that would have created navigation hazards, and they developed the most accurate system for tracking London's consumption patterns. They were like a combination of environmental engineers, market researchers, and archaeologists, except they were 10 years old and probably hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. Take Billy Fortescue, who by age 12 had developed what can only be described as the Victorian equivalent of metal detecting, except instead of fancy equipment, he used a combination of intuition, experience, and what he claimed was supernatural ability to smell copper coins through river mud. Bealey had discovered that drunk gentlemen leaving riverside taverns had a predictable pattern of dropping money, and he'd mapped the entire Thames shoreline based on proximity to drinking establishments and the typical trajectory of inebriated stumbling. Billy's operation worked like this. He'd arrive at low tide with a collection of younger children who served as his excavation crew. While they did the actual digging through the revolting mud, Billy would survey the territory, general planning a battle, directing his team to the most promising locations based on his analysis of tidal patterns, recent weather, and intelligence about which ships had recently unloaded cargo upstream. One of his associates, a girl named Molly, who couldn't have been more than 9, allegedly found a gold ring worth more than most working-class families earned in a year, buried in mud directly below a spot where wealthy couples took romantic evening walks. The organizational structure was surprisingly sophisticated. Bealey had established a training program for new mudlarks, teaching them to distinguish between worthless debris and potentially valuable finds. He'd developed a classification system for different types of discoveries, with appropriate pricing for when they sold items to various types of buyers. Coins went to money changers, metal scraps went to smiths, and interesting curiosities went to collectors who paid premium prices for unusual finds. But the real genius of Billy's operation was his intelligence network. He had connections throughout London's service industry. Stable boys who overheard conversations about lost valuables, pub workers who knew which customers were likely to be careless with money, and dock workers who could predict when valuable cargo might accidentally end up in the river. Bealey was essentially running a combination of legitimate salvage operation and semi-legal treasure hunting service, with customer service that would make modern businesses jealous. Another example involved a group of mudlarks who specialized in what they called bone running, collecting animal bones that had been thrown into the river after butchering. These bones were valuable for making glue, fertilizer, and various industrial chemicals, but the children had figured out that certain types of bones were worth significantly more than others. They developed expertise in animal anatomy that would have impressed veterinary students. Also, they could maximize their profit margins on literal garbage. The bone runners had established relationships with specific manufacturers who would pay premium prices for particular types of bones delivered. In good condition, they developed techniques for cleaning and preserving their finds, and they operated what was essentially a quality control system to ensure they only delivered bones that met their customers' specifications. These were children who couldn't read or write, but they could identify the difference between cow vertebrae and sheep ribs at a glance, and they knew the current market price for both. One legendary mudlark, known only as Tiny Jack, allegedly discovered a cache of Roman coins that had been buried in the riverbank for over 1,000 years. Jack was smart enough to realize these were worth more than their weight in gold to collectors, and he managed to sell them through a network of middlemen for enough money to rent a proper room and buy decent clothes. Within 6 months, he'd transitioned from mudlark to middle-class respectability, proving that sometimes the best way out of poverty was literally digging through other people's discarded wealth. But it wasn't that simple, because the Thames was basically a liquid death trap that happened to occasionally contain valuable items. The mud wasn't just dirty. It was contaminated with industrial chemicals, human waste, and rotting organic matter that created a toxic environment capable of causing infections that would kill you faster than Victorian doctors could mispronounce your symptoms. Children regularly died from cuts that became infected, from diseases contracted through contact with contaminated water, or from drowning when they became trapped in the shifting mud during incoming tides. The legal situation was equally hazardous. Technically, anything found in the Thames belonged to the Crown, which meant mudlarking was theft. But practically, the authorities had bigger problems than prosecuting children for stealing garbage. However, this legal ambiguity meant that mudlarks had no protection from adult criminals who would rob them of their fines, or from unscrupulous buyers who would cheat them on prices, knowing the children had no legal recourse. The economic contradictions were even more complex. While successful mudlarks like Bealey could earn more than many legitimate workers, the vast majority barely scraped together enough to survive. The good finds were rare, and the competition was fierce. New children entered the mudlark workforce constantly, driven by desperation, but most lacked the knowledge and connections necessary to compete with established operators. The result was a harsh Darwinian economy, where only the smartest, toughest, and luckiest children survived. There was also the fundamental contradiction that these children were performing valuable economic services while being treated as social problems. They were cleaning the river, recovering lost property, and processing waste materials, but instead of being paid for these services, they were criticized for being dirty, disease-ridden, and morally questionable. The same society that benefited from their work simultaneously condemned them for doing it. Modern environmental scientists would recognize what the mudlarks were doing as essential ecosystem maintenance. But Victorian society saw only dirty children, engaged in disgusting behavior. The mudlarks had accidentally invented sustainable resource recovery, but they got no credit for their innovation. because they were the wrong class, wrong age, and working in the wrong environment for respectable people to take them seriously. The result was a parallel economy that operated with minimal oversight but maximum efficiency. The mudlark community developed its own systems of justice, its own methods for resolving disputes, and its own social hierarchies based on skill, success, and survival rather than birth or education. They created what was essentially a functioning, anarchist society, except with more dysentery and fewer political theories. The established authorities tried various approaches to deal with the mudlark problem. Periodic crackdowns would arrest dozens of children, but they'd be back on the riverfront within days, because the workhouses couldn't hold them, the prisons didn't want them, and nobody had any better ideas for what to do with them. Some reformers tried to establish legitimate employment programs, but these typically offered lower wages, worse working conditions, and more restrictive supervision than mudlarking. So they weren't exactly popular with their target demographic. The church response was predictably useless. Religious organizations would occasionally organize expeditions to the foreshore to distribute food and moral instruction to the mudlarks, but these efforts usually resulted in the children politely accepting the food while completely ignoring the sermons. Some particularly entrepreneurial mudlarks learned to pretend conversion to Christianity multiple times to different missionary groups, earning multiple meals and small gifts for each performance. The economic impact extended far beyond the riverfront. The mudlarks were essentially providing market research data about London's consumption patterns, waste management services, and lost property recovery, all services that had economic value but were being provided for free by people who weren't even being acknowledged for their contributions. The materials they recovered supported various industries, and their knowledge of the Thames foreshore made them valuable unofficial consultants for legitimate businesses that needed to understand riverfront conditions. Perhaps most significantly, the mudlark economy demonstrated that children could create sophisticated economic systems when left to their own devices. They developed specialization, established territories, created trading networks, and maintained quality standards, all without any adult supervision or formal education. They proved that resourcefulness, intelligence, and determination could overcome almost any obstacle, but they also proved that individual success meant nothing if the broader social system was determined to treat you as disposable. The long-term impact was that the mudlarks became a model for other groups of street children. Their techniques for organization, territory management, and resource extraction influenced criminal enterprises, legitimate businesses, and social movements throughout Victorian London and beyond. Meanwhile, while the mudlarks were perfecting the art of profitable garbage collection, another group of street children was developing an entirely different approach to urban survival. The crossing sweepers had figured out that instead of digging through waste, they could make money by moving it around strategically, creating a service industry based on the simple principle that wealthy people would pay to avoid stepping in horse manure. But the crossing sweepers weren't just providing a cleaning service, they were running an early version of urban traffic management, complete with territorial disputes, price fixing, and customer service innovations that would make modern businesses jealous. They discovered that controlling pedestrian flow was almost as profitable as controlling information, and they used both to build an economic empire based on keeping wealthy people's shoes clean and their consciences clear. The relationship between mudlarks and crossing sweepers wasn't competitive, it was symbiotic. They operated in different environments, served different customer bases, and often collaborated on larger projects that required both riverfront expertise and street-level intelligence. Together, they were accidentally creating London's first comprehensive urban maintenance system, operated entirely by people who couldn't vote, couldn't own property, and couldn't legally enter into contracts. If mudlarking was Victorian London's version of underwater treasure hunting, then crossing sweeping was the city's first successful traffic management system, except instead of directing cars, these children were choreographing the movement of pedestrians, horses, and approximately 14 tons of fresh manure that London's streets produced daily. While the mudlarks were digging through garbage, the crossing sweepers had figured out that the real money was in moving garbage around in precisely the right patterns to extract maximum profit from people's basic desire to ruin their shoes. The crossing sweeper system emerged from a simple observation. Wealthy Victorians would rather pay a child a few pennies than navigate London's streets, which were essentially open sewers with a light coating of gravel for texture. But what started as a basic service industry quickly evolved into something that resembled a combination of urban planning, psychological manipulation, and performance art, all conducted by children who'd never heard of any of those concepts, but had mastered the practical applications. These weren't just kids with brooms randomly cleaning patches of street. The successful crossing sweepers had developed sophisticated understanding of pedestrian traffic patterns, optimal timing for maximum customer interaction, and pricing strategies that would make modern dynamic pricing algorithms look primitive. They knew which corners generated the most foot traffic, what times of day produced the most generous customers, and how to position themselves to intercept wealthy pedestrians at precisely the moment when paying for clean passage seemed like a reasonable investment. The crossing sweeper economy was built on the fundamental principle that cleanliness was worth more to rich people than the actual cost of achieving it. A gentleman could spend more on having his shoes cleaned after walking through mud than he'd spend on food for an entire week. But he'd happily pay a child a few pennies to prevent the problem in the first place. The crossing sweepers had accidentally discovered the economic principle of preventive maintenance, except they were applying it to pedestrian infrastructure and charging customers for the privilege. What made this particularly ingenious was that crossing sweepers were essentially creating the demand for their own services by selectively cleaning certain areas while leaving others deliberately messy. They could guide pedestrian traffic toward their maintained crossings and away from areas where they didn't want competition. They were practicing urban design without knowing the terminology, and their methods were surprisingly effective. Consider the legendary Jimmy the Brush Morrison, who by age 11 had established what can only be described as the Victorian equivalent of a franchise operation. Jimmy didn't just sweep one crossing. He'd identified the 12 most profitable street corners in central London and had recruited a team of younger children to work each location under his supervision. His business model was based on the realization that consistency was more valuable than perfection. Customers would pay premium prices for crossings that were always clean, rather than occasionally spotless. Jimmy's operation worked like a well-oiled machine. Each of his junior sweepers was assigned a specific corner with specific instructions about pricing, customer service, and territorial boundaries. Jimmy would make rounds throughout the day, collecting fees, providing fresh supplies, and resolving disputes with competing sweepers. He'd established relationships with local businesses that generated the most profitable customers, and he'd developed a system of kickbacks and referrals that ensured his sweepers got first access to the wealthiest pedestrians. But Jimmy's real innovation was recognizing that crossing sweeping was really a customer service business disguised as manual labor. He trained his team to recognize different types of customers and adjust their approach accordingly. Wealthy ladies required a different sales pitch than business gentlemen, and tourists needed different services than local residents. Jimmy's sweepers could spot a profitable customer from 50 yards away and position themselves to intercept at exactly the right moment with exactly the right combination of pathetic appearance and efficient service. The crown jewel of Jimmy's empire was his relationship with the Pemberton family, wealthy merchants who lived in a mansion near several of his prime locations. Jimmy had noticed that Mrs. Pemberton took the same route to her favorite shops every Tuesday and Friday, and he'd arranged for her path to be perfectly clean, while alternative routes remained mysteriously muddy. Mrs. Pemberton began to think of Jimmy as her crossing sweeper, and she'd specifically request his services even when other children were available. Jimmy was essentially providing concierge-level customer service, except his concierge desk was a pile of brooms, and his uniform was whatever clothes he could find. Another fascinating case involved a girl, Mary Fletcher, who discovered that crossing sweeping was actually an excellent cover for gathering intelligence about wealthy customers. While she swept, Mary would listen to conversations, observe shopping patterns, and note personal details that could be valuable to other members of the street children community. She knew which families were planning to travel valuable information for burglars, which merchants were struggling financially, useful for pickpockets who wanted to avoid targets with tight security, and which wealthy individuals had particular weaknesses or habits that could be exploited. Mary had developed a side business selling information to other street children, essentially operating as a private intelligence service disguised as a cleaning lady. She'd figured out that wealthy people talked freely around service workers because they didn't consider them worth noticing, and she used this social invisibility to gather information that was worth far more than her cleaning fees. Mary was accidentally pioneering the concept of social engineering, decades before anyone had a name for it. Perhaps the most impressive crossing sweeper operation belonged to a boy known only as the Professor, who'd realized that the real money wasn't in cleaning streets but in managing traffic flow. The Professor had studied pedestrian patterns with the intensity of a modern traffic engineer, and had developed techniques for subtly directing people toward his preferred crossings while making competitors' locations seem less attractive. The Professor's methods included strategic placement of obstacles that would force pedestrians to choose specific routes, timing his cleaning activities to create artificial scarcity, making his services seem more valuable, and collaborating with other street children to create coordinated customer experiences. If a wealthy family was walking toward his crossing, the Professor could arrange for flower sellers to approach from one direction and newspaper boys from another, effectively herding the customers toward his perfectly clean crossing where they'd gratefully pay for a safe passage. The Professor had essentially created London's first pedestrian traffic management system, operated entirely by children who were being paid by the customers they were manipulating. He understood that controlling movement was more profitable than providing services, and he'd built a business model based on manufactured convenience rather than genuine necessity. This wasn't isolated to a few exceptional individuals. Across London, crossing sweepers were independently developing similar strategies because the economic incentives rewarded innovation and efficiency. The successful sweepers shared certain patterns. They understood customer psychology. They recognized the value of consistency over perfection, and they'd figured out that territorial cooperation was more profitable than endless competition. The pattern that emerged was essentially child-operated urban infrastructure. These children were providing services that the city government should have been handling, but they were doing it more efficiently and more responsively than any official system could have managed. They were practicing customer service, market, research, and strategic planning without any formal training, simply because the economic environment rewarded these skills. What made this pattern particularly interesting was how it spread through the street children community. Successful techniques would be copied and adapted by children in different neighborhoods, creating a kind of informal knowledge transfer system. A strategy that worked in wealthy areas would be modified for middle-class districts, and innovations developed in commercial areas would be adapted for residential neighborhoods. The crossing sweepers were accidentally creating London's first crowdsourced urban planning system. The most successful sweepers also developed what we'd now recognize as brand loyalty. Regular customers would specifically seek out particular children, not just because they provided good service, but because they'd established personal relationships based on reliability and trust. Mrs. Pemberton didn't just want her crossing swept. She wanted Jimmy to sweep it, because she'd learned to trust his consistency and professionalism. This pattern of personal branding was revolutionary in a society where service workers were typically interchangeable and invisible. The crossing sweepers had figured out that individual relationships were more valuable than generic services, and they'd built business models based on customer retention rather than just customer acquisition. They were practicing relationship marketing decades before businesses had developed formal theories about customer loyalty. The economic patterns were also remarkably sophisticated. Successful crossing sweepers understood seasonal variations. Wealthy people were more generous during certain times of year. Weather-related demand, muddy days were more profitable than dry days, and market saturation to many sweepers in one area reduced everyone's profits. They developed informal systems for territorial management that prevented destructive competition, while still allowing for a healthy rivalry that improved service quality. The effects were far-reaching and often unintended. The crossing sweeper system created the first reliable pedestrian infrastructure in Victorian London, but it also created a generation of children who understood business principles, customer service, and market dynamics better than most adults. These kids were getting practical education in economics, psychology, and urban planning, while the formal education system was focused on Latin grammar and moral instruction. The immediate beneficiaries were obviously the wealthy pedestrians, who could now navigate London streets without ruining their expensive clothes. But the broader economic impact was more complex. The crossing sweepers were essentially subsidizing the luxury lifestyle of the upper classes by providing services that made urban living more pleasant for people who could afford to pay for convenience. They were creating a service economy that allowed wealthy people to avoid the unpleasant realities of city life while remaining physically present in urban environments. The children themselves benefited from steady income, but they also suffered from the physical demands of the work and the social stigma associated with being street children. The most successful sweepers could earn enough to afford basic necessities, but they remained vulnerable to exploitation, violence, and the various diseases that thrived in Victorian London's unsanitary conditions. Their success was always precarious, dependent on continued demand from customers who could easily decide to avoid the streets entirely or find alternative transportation. The unintended consequences were perhaps most significant. The crossing sweeper system demonstrated that children could organize effective service industries without adult supervision, but it also created a dependency relationship that kept these children permanently positioned as service providers for the wealthy rather than helping them escape poverty entirely. The system was efficient and profitable, but it didn't provide pathways to social mobility. It just made poverty more organized and slightly less desperate. The long-term effects influenced Victorian attitudes toward child labor, urban planning, and social services. Reformers pointed to the crossing sweepers as evidence that children needed protection from exploitation, while economists noted their efficiency and innovation. The crossing sweeper phenomenon contributed to debates about the role of government in providing public services and the appropriate relationship between private enterprise and public infrastructure. Perhaps most importantly, the crossing sweepers proved that given economic incentives and minimal interference, children could create sophisticated systems for solving urban problems. They demonstrated resourcefulness, creativity, and business acumen that challenged Victorian assumptions about childhood, intelligence, and social class. Their success raised uncomfortable questions about why society was allowing children to provide essential services rather than creating systems that would allow them to be children instead of tiny entrepreneurs. Yet even as Jimmy the Brush Morrison was building his crossing sweeper empire and the professor was revolutionizing pedestrian traffic management, another group of street children was developing survival strategies that made sweeping look like a leisurely hobby. The climbing boys, children who cleaned chimneys from the inside, had discovered that the most dangerous jobs paid the best wages, but they'd also discovered that extreme danger created opportunities for extreme innovation. The climbing boys weren't just providing a cleaning service, they were operating in an environment so hazardous that it forced them to develop techniques for survival that would make modern extreme sports athletes look like cautious amateurs. They were working in spaces so confined that adults couldn't fit, performing tasks so dangerous that insurance companies would have refused to cover them, and doing it all while maintaining the kind of customer service standards that kept wealthy homeowners satisfied with their work. But the climbing boys had also discovered something that would change the entire dynamic of Victorian street children's relationship with adult society. They possessed skills that adults genuinely needed and couldn't replicate. Unlike mudlarks or crossing sweepers, who were providing convenient services, the climbing boys were performing essential maintenance that kept London's heating systems functional. This gave them leverage that other street children lacked, but it also exposed them to dangers that made the Thames foreshore a pleasant garden party. Dogged by the winter of 1851, the chimney sweeping industry had reached a breaking point that would make modern labour disputes look like polite disagreements over tea preferences. The climbing boys, children as young as 6 who were sent up chimneys to clean them from the inside, had discovered that their employers were literally trying to work them to death, and they decided that dying on their own terms might be preferable to dying for someone else's profit. The situation had been building for decades. London's building boom meant more houses, which meant more chimneys, which meant more demand for the only workers small enough to fit inside the narrow flues, children. But the chimney master sweeps had gotten greedy, forcing boys to work longer hours in more dangerous conditions, while paying them less money and providing worse food and shelter. What they hadn't counted on was that these children had been learning organizational skills from every other group of street orphans in London. The climbing boys faced dangers that would make modern occupational safety inspectors require therapy. They worked in spaces so narrow they could barely breathe, inhaling soot that destroyed their lungs, risking getting stuck and dying of suffocation, and regularly suffering burns from chimneys that hadn't cooled properly. The mortality rate was so high that master sweeps factored regular replacement of dead children into their business models, like it was equipment depreciation. But these children had developed something that their employers hadn't expected: solidarity. Unlike mudlarks or crossing sweepers who worked independently, climbing boys worked in teams supervised by adult masters, which meant they had regular contact with other children facing identical problems. They'd begun sharing information about which masters were the most brutal, which houses had the most dangerous chimneys, and which customers paid the best rates for premium work. The crisis began when a master sweep named Jeremiah Blackwood decided to increase profits by forcing his boys to work in chimneys that were still hot from recent fires. When an 8-year-old named Timothy Collins died of burns and smoke inhalation in one of Blackwood's express cleaning operations, the other climbing boys decided they'd had enough of being treated as disposable equipment. What happened next would prove that Victorian children could organize labor action that would make modern union leaders take notes. The rebellion began on a cold December morning when Blackwood's remaining climbing boys, 7 children ranging in age from 6 to 12, simply refused to work. But this wasn't just a strike, it was a coordinated campaign that demonstrated these children had been planning their resistance for months, while pretending to be obedient servants. The leader was a 10-year-old known as Sooty Pete, who'd earned his nickname from spending more time inside chimneys than most adults spent in their own homes. Pete had done something unprecedented. He'd been secretly teaching the other boys to read using scraps of newspaper they found in the houses they cleaned. More importantly, he'd been teaching them to understand their legal rights, which turned out to be practically non-existent, but theoretically interesting. When Blackwood ordered the boys to begin their rounds that morning, Pete stepped forward and announced that they would no longer work for masters who couldn't guarantee their safety. But Pete wasn't just making demands, he was presenting a business proposal. The boys had secretly been mapping every chimney in their territory, noting which houses paid the best rates, which customers were the most generous with tips, and which chimneys required the most dangerous techniques. Mr. Blackwood, Pete reportedly said, with the confidence of a child who'd learned that adults were just as afraid of losing money as children were of dying, "We know where all the good work is, and we know how to do it proper. You need us more than we need you." Then he presented Blackwood with what amounted to a detailed business plan for improved working conditions, better pay distribution, and safety protocols that would reduce the death rate to merely life-threatening instead of virtually certain. Blackwood's response was predictably violent. He grabbed Pete and threatened to beat him unconscious. But the other boys had prepared for this possibility. They'd positioned themselves near the exits, and when Blackwood lunged for Pete, they scattered like a coordinated military operation. But instead of running away completely, they'd positioned themselves throughout the neighborhood, where they began implementing the most brilliantly vindictive labor action in Victorian history. The boys had realized that their real power wasn't in their ability to work. It was in their detailed knowledge of every house in the area. They began visiting Blackwood's customers directly, not to offer cleaning services, but to share interesting information about what they'd observed during their previous visits. They told Mrs. Wellington that her husband had been hiding bottles of expensive brandy in the library chimney. They informed Mr. Hartwell that his teenage son had been using the attic fireplace to dispose of love letters from questionable young ladies. They let the Pemberton family know that their cook had been stealing food and hiding it in the kitchen chimney. Within hours, Blackwood was receiving angry visits from customers who were furious about having their private business exposed by their chimney sweep's employees. But the boys weren't finished. They'd also begun visiting other master sweeps in the area, offering to share their detailed knowledge of the neighborhood's chimney systems in exchange for better working conditions than Blackwood provided. The situation escalated when the boys implemented what they called selective cleaning. They would show up at houses and clean the chimneys perfectly, but only after sharing gossip about the homeowners with their neighbors. Mrs. Wellington discovered that her servants had been spreading stories about her brandy-hiding husband to other households. Mr. Hartwell learned that his son's romantic indiscretions were being discussed at tea parties throughout the district. Meanwhile, Pete had been busy recruiting allies from other groups of street children. He'd established connections with crossing sweepers who could spread information about the rebellion, mudlarks who could provide intelligence about which houses were connected to the sewer system valuable for sabotage purposes, and flower sellers who could serve as messengers between different groups of climbing boys throughout London. The climax came when Blackwood, now facing a complete collapse of his customer base and recruitment from competing master sweeps, attempted to have Pete arrested for theft. But Pete had anticipated this move. When the constable arrived to arrest him, Pete was waiting with a collection of witnesses, other street children who could testify that Blackwood had been forcing children to work in unsafe conditions, stealing their wages, and providing inadequate food and shelter. More importantly, Pete had convinced several of Blackwood's former customers to support the boys' cause. Mrs. Wellington, despite being embarrassed by the brandy revelation, had been impressed by Pete's intelligence and organizational skills. She testified that the boys had always provided excellent service, and that Blackwood had been overcharging for their work, while clearly underpaying and mistreating his employees. The final blow came when Pete revealed his ultimate strategy. He'd been keeping detailed records of every house they'd cleaned, every dangerous situation they'd encountered, and every safety violation Blackwood had forced them to ignore. He presented these records to the constable as evidence that Blackwood was operating an enterprise that regularly endangered children's lives for profit. The response was immediate and chaotic. Blackwood found himself facing not just a labor rebellion, but a public relations disaster that threatened to destroy his entire business. Other master sweeps were forced to choose between supporting Blackwood and risking similar rebellions from their own climbing boys, or distancing themselves from him and appearing to support child-led labor action. The constable, faced with a situation that didn't fit any legal precedents he'd encountered, made the practical decision to arrest Blackwood for endangering children rather than arresting Pete for rebellion. This was less about justice than about avoiding paperwork. Prosecuting an adult for child endangerment was straightforward, while prosecuting a 10-year-old for organizing labor action would have required legal theories that didn't exist yet. The immediate consequence was that Pete and his fellow rebels found themselves in an unprecedented position. They were free from Blackwood, but they were also unemployed in an industry where their specialized skills were still desperately needed. However, Pete had planned for this possibility too. Within a week, he'd established what amounted to an independent chimney sweeping cooperative, with the boys working directly for customers, without master sweep intermediaries. The customer response was surprisingly positive. Many homeowners had been uncomfortable with the obvious mistreatment of the climbing boys, but hadn't known how to address the problem without losing access to essential chimney cleaning services. Pete's cooperative offered the same services, with better customer relations, no more embarrassing gossip sharing, and more reliable scheduling. No more boys who were too sick or injured to work effectively. Other master sweeps initially tried to undercut Pete's cooperative by offering lower prices, but they discovered that Pete had anticipated this strategy too. The boys had established relationships with customers based on trust and reliability, rather than just price, and they'd proven that treating workers better actually resulted in higher quality service. Several of Pete's customers, specifically, requested his team, even when cheaper alternatives were available. The political consequences were more complex. Reform movements pointed to Pete's rebellion as evidence that child labor laws needed strengthening, while business interests argued that the boys had proven they could negotiate fair working conditions without government interference. Religious organizations were torn between admiring the boys' initiative and being horrified by their methods of exposing private family information. The most significant long-term consequence was that Pete's success inspired similar organizing efforts among other groups of working children throughout London. Crossing sweepers began coordinating territory assignments to reduce destructive competition. Mudlarks started sharing information about profitable locations instead of fighting over them. Flower sellers established quality standards and pricing agreements that benefited everyone except customers who'd been used to exploiting desperate children. The establishment response was predictably confused. Pete had demonstrated that children could organize effective resistance to exploitation, but he'd done it using methods that were technically legal if they were socially disruptive. His rebellion had improved working conditions and customer satisfaction while reducing business costs and improving service quality. It was hard to argue that this was a bad outcome, even if the methods had been unconventional. This chimney sweep rebellion wasn't just about working conditions. It was about power, information, and the discovery that children could be more effective at solving adult problems than adults were. Pete had proven that detailed knowledge of local conditions, combined with strategic thinking and coordinated action, could overcome significant disadvantages in resources and legal status. The rebellion revealed that street children possessed sophisticated understanding of economic relationships, social dynamics, and organizational psychology. They weren't just surviving in an hostile environment. They were analyzing that environment and developing strategies to improve it. Pete's success demonstrated that intelligence and planning could be more powerful than physical strength or legal authority. What made this particularly significant was that Pete's methods were fundamentally different from traditional forms of resistance. He hadn't used violence, he hadn't broken laws, and he hadn't appealed to moral sentiment. Instead, he'd used information, economic leverage, and social pressure to create conditions where cooperation was more profitable than exploitation. He'd essentially invented community organizing, decades before anyone had formal theories about it. The broader implication was that Victorian society had been consistently underestimating the capabilities of its most vulnerable members. These children weren't just victims of circumstance. They were intelligent agents capable of creative problem solving, strategic planning, and effective collective action. The rebellion forced adults to reconsider their assumptions about childhood, authority, and the relationship between social class and intelligence. Most importantly, Pete's rebellion demonstrated that the street children weren't separate from mainstream society. They were an integral part of London's economic and social systems, with detailed knowledge of how those systems actually functioned. Their resistance wasn't an attack on civilization. It was an attempt to make civilization work better for everyone involved. The fact that a 10-year-old could organize more effective labor relations than adult business owners said something profound about the priorities and competence of Victorian society's leadership. Around the main drama of mudlarks, crossing sweepers, and climbing boys, dozens of other street children played crucial roles in Victorian London's underground economy. each representing a different approach to the fundamental problem of staying alive in a city that seemed designed to kill them. These weren't minor players. They were specialists who'd carved out their own niches in London's survival ecosystem. Meet Flower Annie, a 12-year-old entrepreneur who'd discovered that selling flowers was really about selling hope, romance, and social status rather than actual botanical products. Annie had realized that gentlemen bought flowers not because they needed decorative plants, but because purchasing flowers from a sweet-looking child made them feel charitable, while simultaneously providing them with romantic props for impressing ladies. Annie's genius was understanding that she was really in the customer service business, disguised as horticulture, so she developed different sales pitches for different types of customers: romantic advice for young men, compliments for older gentlemen, and sympathetic listening for anyone who seemed lonely. Annie had also figured out that flower selling provided excellent cover for intelligence gathering. While she chatted with customers about which flowers would best express their romantic intentions, she was actually learning about their personal lives, financial situations, and social connections. She sold this information to pickpockets who wanted to know which targets were worth pursuing, to other street children who needed to understand neighborhood social dynamics, and occasionally to wives who wanted to know whether their husbands were buying flowers for other women. Then there was Newspaper Joe, who transformed the supposedly simple job of selling newspapers into a comprehensive information brokerage service. Joe had discovered that people would pay extra for newspapers if you could also provide commentary about the stories, insider information about local events, and gossip about people mentioned in the articles. He'd established a network of sources throughout London's service industries: stable boys, kitchen maids, delivery workers, who would share information in exchange for small payments or favorable coverage in Joe's unofficial verbal newspaper supplements. Joe's operation was remarkably sophisticated. He knew which stories would interest which types of customers, and he'd developed different versions of the same events for different audiences. A political scandal might be presented as entertainment for working-class customers, moral instruction for religious customers, or business intelligence for merchants who needed to understand changing social conditions. Joe was essentially operating London's first personalized news service, decades before anyone had invented the technology to make such customization efficient. Perhaps most impressive was Dancing Mary, a girl who discovered that street performance could be more profitable than traditional begging, but only if you understood your audience better than they understood themselves. Mary had developed a repertoire of performances tailored to specific locations and customer demographics: sad, pathetic dances for wealthy ladies who wanted to feel charitable, energetic, entertaining performances for working-class crowds who wanted value for their entertainment spending, and sophisticated, artistic pieces for middle-class audiences who wanted to feel cultured while helping the deserving poor. Mary's real innovation was understanding that street performance was about creating experiences rather than just demonstrating skills. She would research her audiences, learning about local events, seasonal celebrations, and social tensions that might influence how people responded to different types of performances. During political tensions, she'd perform patriotic pieces. During religious holidays, she'd incorporate spiritual themes. During economic downturns, she'd focus on performances that made people feel hopeful about the future. But Mary had also discovered that performance provided unique opportunities for social commentary. Through her dances, she could mock wealthy people's pretensions, comment on political events, and express opinions that would have been dangerous if stated directly. Her performances were simultaneously entertainment, social criticism, and emotional therapy for audiences who needed ways to process the complexities of Victorian life. These three represent hundreds of other street children who'd found creative solutions to the problem of extracting money from adults while providing genuine value in return. Each had discovered that success required understanding psychology, economics, and social dynamics in ways that formal education didn't teach, but street life demanded. These weren't isolated incidents operating in separate spheres. The street children of Victorian London had created an interconnected network that functioned like a parallel society with its own economy, communication systems, and mutual support structures. The relationships between different groups were complex webs of cooperation, competition, and strategic alliance that would make modern business networks look simple by comparison. The connection between Flower Annie and newspaper Joe illustrates how these networks functioned. Annie's customers often wanted to know about social events where their flower purchases might be most effective, while Joe's customers wanted to understand the romantic and social implications of the news stories they were reading. Annie and Joe had developed a referral system where they would direct customers to each other when their services were complementary, and they'd share information that helped both of them provide better customer service. For example, when Joe learned about upcoming social events from his news sources, he'd share this information with Annie so she could position herself in locations where flower demand would be highest. When Annie learned about romantic scandals or social tensions from her customers, she'd share this intelligence with Joe so he could provide more informed commentary about related news stories. They were essentially operating a joint intelligence and customer service operation disguised as separate businesses. The relationship between Dancing Mary and the various working children was even more complex. Mary's performances often served as informal communication hubs where street children could share information, coordinate activities, and resolve disputes without attracting adult attention. Her performance locations became meeting places where crossing sweepers could coordinate territory assignments, mudlarks could share information about profitable locations, and climbing boys could discuss safety strategies and working conditions. Mary had also developed her performances into a kind of early warning system for the street children community. Through her songs and dances, she could spread information about police crackdowns, warn about dangerous customers, and alert other children to new opportunities or threats. Her audiences assumed they were just watching entertainment, but the other street children in the crowd were receiving detailed intelligence about conditions throughout London. The most sophisticated example of these interconnected relationships involved what the children called the Sunday market, an informal gathering that took place in different locations each week, where street children would trade goods, services, and information. Mudlarks would trade valuable finds for food or clothing. Crossing sweepers would share intelligence about profitable locations. Flower sellers would provide flowers for special occasions, and newspaper boys would share information about upcoming events that might create business opportunities. But the Sunday market was more than just a trading post. It was also a training ground where experienced street children would teach survival skills to newcomers, a social support system where children could find emotional support and friendship, and a primitive banking system where successful children could store valuable items or money with trusted associates. The market had its own rules, its own systems for resolving disputes, and its own methods for enforcing agreements that didn't rely on any official authority. The children had also developed what amounted to an informal insurance system. When a successful street child was injured, arrested, or otherwise unable to work, other children would provide temporary support, with the understanding that similar help would be available if their situations were reversed. This system was based on reciprocity rather than charity. It was mutual aid that recognized that everyone's survival was precarious, and that cooperation was more effective than pure competition. Perhaps most remarkably, the street children had created their own educational system where practical knowledge about survival, customer service, and urban navigation was passed down from older children to younger ones. This education was far more relevant to their daily lives than anything offered by formal schools, and it was more immediately useful than the moral instruction provided by religious organizations. The result was a shadow society that operated parallel to legitimate institutions, but with greater efficiency, more responsive customer service, and better adapted survival strategies. The street children weren't just individual success stories. They were members of a functioning alternative civilization that had developed its own solutions to problems that official society couldn't or wouldn't address. To understand how these children created such sophisticated systems, you have to understand that Victorian London wasn't just a city. It was a massive social experiment where traditional rural communities had been broken apart and reassembled into something entirely new. Except nobody had written an instruction manual, and most of the adults were making it up as they went along. The daily life of street children was governed by rhythms that had nothing to do with conventional schedules. They woke up when they needed to work, ate when they could afford food, and slept wherever they could find safe shelter. Their calendar was organized around market days, weather patterns, and the social rhythms of their customers rather than religious holidays or school terms. They lived in a completely different temporal reality from the rest of society. Their belief systems were pragmatic rather than ideological. They believed in things that worked: loyalty among friends, the importance of reputation, the value of reliable information, and the principle that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally if circumstances changed. They had little patience for abstract moral principles that didn't translate into improved survival odds, but they had highly developed codes of ethics based on reciprocity, honesty in business dealings, and protection of younger or weaker members of their community. The social structures they created were remarkably egalitarian compared to mainstream Victorian society. Success was based on demonstrated competence rather than birth, gender, or social connections. A girl could lead a business operation if she was more effective than her male competitors, and age was less important than intelligence and reliability. The street children had accidentally created a merit-based society that was more democratic than the official political system. Their relationship with mainstream culture was complex and adaptive. They understood the social signals that would make adults see them as deserving of help rather than suspicion, and they could switch between different personas depending on what the situation required. They were multilingual in the sense that they could communicate effectively with people from different social classes, occupations, and cultural backgrounds. What was normal for street children would have been extraordinary for middle-class children. They routinely made independent economic decisions, traveled throughout the city without supervision, and took responsibility for their own survival in ways that most adults found shocking. They had adult-level knowledge about human nature, economic principles, and social dynamics, but they were still children who played games, formed friendships, and created entertainment when they had spare time. The irony was that these children, who were considered social problems by respectable society, had actually developed more effective solutions to urban living than most official institutions. They understood London better than city planners. They provided customer service that exceeded most legitimate businesses, and they'd created social support systems that were more responsive than government programs or religious charities. Perhaps most ironic was that the children society considered most dangerous and uncontrollable had actually created the most orderly and efficient systems for urban survival. While adults were debating theories about social organization, these children were implementing practical solutions that worked. They'd accidentally discovered principles of market economics, democratic organization, and community cooperation that economists and political theorists were still trying to understand. The contradiction between their reputation and their reality was stark. Society saw dangerous criminals, but they were actually providing essential services. Society saw moral corruption, but they had developed ethical systems based on mutual support and honest dealing. Society saw chaos, but they had created sophisticated organizational structures that maintained order without requiring official authority. Another contradiction was that these supposedly uneducated children had developed more practical knowledge about psychology, economics, and social dynamics than most university-educated adults possessed. They understood customer service, market research, and strategic planning in ways that formal business education didn't teach, simply because their survival depended on getting these things right. The most profound irony was that the children, who were excluded from legitimate society, had become its most insightful critics and most innovative problem solvers. They could see contradictions and inefficiencies that adults couldn't recognize because they weren't invested in maintaining systems that didn't work. Their outsider perspective allowed them to develop solutions that insiders couldn't imagine. Modern social workers would recognize many of their innovations as sophisticated examples of community organizing, peer education, and mutual aid networks. These children had independently developed social technologies that professional reformers would later claim as new discoveries, proving that intelligence and creativity weren't limited by education or social class. They were universal human capacities that emerged whenever people faced challenges requiring creative solutions. Everything changed when Parliament passed the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1864, which sounds like dry legislative business until you realize it was basically the government's admission that 10-year-olds had been running better labor relations than adult business owners. The act wasn't just about chimney sweeping. It was the first official recognition that children might actually be people with rights, rather than convenient tiny workers who could fit into spaces adults couldn't access. But here's where it gets interesting. The law wasn't passed because politicians suddenly developed consciences about child welfare. It was passed because Sooty Pete's rebellion had inspired similar organizing efforts throughout London's working children community, and the resulting disruptions were making life uncomfortable for wealthy people who relied on child labor, but didn't want to think about the ethical implications of their lifestyle choices. The background to this change was that Pete's success had created a demonstration effect that spread like wildfire through Victorian London's underground economy. Crossing sweepers began refusing to work dangerous corners without hazard pay. Mudlarks started demanding better prices for their fines and safer working conditions along the Thames. Flower sellers organized to establish minimum prices and territory agreements. Even the traditionally passive pure finders, children who collected dog waste for industrial purposes, began coordinating to improve their bargaining position with buyers. What made this moment different from previous attempts at child labour reform was that the children themselves had become the primary advocates for change, and they'd proven they could organise effective resistance to exploitation without adult leadership. Previous reform efforts had been led by well-meaning adults who had theoretical knowledge about child welfare, but limited understanding of how street children's economy actually functioned. The children's own organising efforts were based on practical experience and detailed knowledge of economic relationships that reformers hadn't even recognised existed. The government's response was typical of Victorian problem solving. They decided to regulate the most visible aspects of child labour while ignoring the underlying economic conditions that made such labour necessary in the first place. The Chimney Sweepers Act banned the use of children under 10 for chimney cleaning and required safety equipment for older children. But it didn't address the fundamental issue that thousands of children had no alternative means of survival. The key factor that led to this transformation was that the children's organising efforts had made their situation impossible for adults to ignore. When crossing sweepers coordinated their activities, wealthy pedestrians couldn't avoid noticing that their convenient street cleaning services were being provided by organised child workers rather than individual beggars. When mudlarks demanded better treatment, dock workers and riverside businesses had to acknowledge that their waste disposal services were being handled by sophisticated child-operated enterprises. Most importantly, the children had learned to use publicity as a weapon. They'd discovered that exposing the contradictions in adult behavior, wealthy people who demanded moral purity while relying on child labor, religious leaders who preached charity while ignoring systematic exploitation, government officials who celebrated British civilization while allowing children to die in industrial accidents, could create pressure for change more effectively than appeals to sympathy or moral sentiment. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't smooth. The process of change revealed just how dependent Victorian London had become on child labour and how resistant adults were to acknowledging that dependency. When the new regulations began to be enforced, the immediate result wasn't improved conditions for children. It was chaos in industries that had built their business models around exploiting child workers. The resistance to change came from unexpected directions. Many master chimney sweeps argued that the new regulations would destroy their businesses and leave both adults and children unemployed. Some parents complained that preventing their children from working would create family financial crises. Even some of the children themselves worried that legal protection might eliminate their economic opportunities without providing alternative means of survival. The climbing boys faced a particularly complex situation. The new law meant they could no longer legally work in the most dangerous chimneys, but it also meant they lost access to the highest paying jobs in their industry. Some adapted by becoming consultants who could advise adult chimney sweeps about technical challenges, but others found themselves competing for less specialized work with fewer opportunities for the kind of economic independence they'd achieved in their previous illegal employment. Pete's response to these challenges demonstrated the sophisticated strategic thinking that had made his rebellion successful in the first place. Instead of opposing the new regulations, he embraced them as an opportunity to legitimize his cooperative business model. He worked with sympathetic adult reformers to establish training programs that would teach proper chimney cleaning techniques to adult workers while employing former climbing boys as instructors and technical advisors. But Pete also recognized that legal protection was meaningless without economic alternatives. He used his connections throughout the street children community to help former climbing boys transition into other forms of work: crossing sweeping, mudlarking, flower selling, and various other occupations that offered income without the extreme physical dangers of chimney work. He essentially created London's first career transition program for child workers, operated entirely through informal networks that government agencies couldn't have replicated. The champions of change weren't just reformers and former child workers. They also included some unexpected allies from the business community who had realized that Pete's innovations in labor relations were actually more profitable than traditional exploitation. Several master sweeps discovered that treating workers better resulted in higher quality service, better customer relationships, and more reliable workforce retention. They began adopting Pete's methods not out of moral conviction, but because they produced better business results. The breakthrough moments came when the children's organizing efforts began to influence adult labor relations. Workers in other industries started adopting techniques the street children had developed, sharing information about working conditions, coordinating responses to employer demands, and using publicity to pressure employers who relied on public reputation for their business success. The children had accidentally become labor relations consultants for the adult working class. However, the obstacles encountered during this transformation were significant. Many employers responded to increased regulation by simply moving their operations to areas where enforcement was lax, or by developing new forms of exploitation that weren't covered by existing laws. Some replaced child workers with machinery that was more expensive but less likely to organize resistance movements. Others relocated their businesses to other cities where child labor regulations were less strict. The role of individual leadership versus larger historical forces created interesting tensions during this period. Pete's personal charisma and strategic intelligence had clearly been crucial to initiating change, but the spread of organizing techniques throughout the street children community suggested that similar developments would have occurred even without his specific contributions. The children's innovations emerged from practical necessity rather than individual genius, which meant they could be replicated and adapted by anyone facing similar challenges. Perhaps most importantly, the process of change revealed that the street children had developed social technologies that were applicable far beyond their specific circumstances. Their methods for building solidarity, sharing resources, and organizing collective action provided models that adult workers, women's rights advocates, and other social movements would later adopt and adapt for their own purposes. The enforcement of new regulations also created unexpected opportunities for the children to demonstrate their expertise. Former climbing boys became inspectors who could identify dangerous working conditions that adult officials might miss. Crossing sweepers became informal consultants for city planning efforts aimed at improving pedestrian safety. Mudlarks provided environmental expertise about Thames pollution that helped inform public health initiatives. The new system that emerged from these changes was fundamentally different from both the old exploitation model and the idealistic visions of child welfare. Reformers, instead of eliminating child labor, the reforms had created a more regulated and slightly less dangerous version that acknowledged children's economic agency while providing minimal protections against the most extreme forms of abuse. The children, who'd been most successful under the old system, adapted quickly to the new rules, often finding ways to use legal protections to improve their bargaining positions with adult employers and customers. Pete's Chimney Sweeping Cooperative became a model for other child-operated enterprises that could provide services while complying with safety regulations. Crossing sweepers organized formal territory assignments that reduced destructive competition while maintaining service quality. Mudlarks established safety protocols that reduced injury rates while preserving access to profitable salvage opportunities. But the new reality also created new categories of winners and losers among the street children community. The most intelligent and well-connected children found opportunities to transition into legitimate employment or small business ownership, while children who lacked these advantages often found themselves pushed into forms of work that were less visible but not necessarily less dangerous or exploitative. The relationship between children and adult society had been permanently altered. Adults could no longer pretend that child labor was invisible, or that children were passive victims of circumstances beyond their control. The children had demonstrated their capacity for independent thought, strategic planning, and collective action in ways that forced adults to recognize them as economic and political actors, rather than just objects of charity or control. However, this recognition came with new forms of surveillance and regulation that limited some of the freedoms the children had enjoyed under the previous system of benign neglect. Government officials, reform organizations, and law enforcement agencies began paying much closer attention to street children's activities, which reduced their ability to operate in the legal gray areas that had previously provided opportunities for creative problem solving. The economic impact was complex and sometimes contradictory. Some legitimate businesses discovered that employing former street children brought valuable skills and knowledge that improved their operations. The children's understanding of customer service, urban geography, and practical problem solving made them valuable employees for businesses that could recognize and utilize their expertise. At the same time, the elimination of the most exploitative forms of child labor created labor shortages in industries that had become dependent on very cheap workers. Some businesses responded by improving wages and working conditions to attract adult workers, while others simply relocated to areas where regulations were less strictly enforced. The social changes were perhaps most significant. The street children's organizing efforts had demonstrated that intelligence, creativity, and leadership weren't limited by social class, education, or age. Their success challenged Victorian assumptions about natural hierarchy and social order in ways that influenced broader debates about democracy, education, and social reform. The children themselves had gained something unprecedented: recognition as legitimate participants in society rather than problems to be solved. They'd proven that they could contribute to solutions for urban challenges, and they'd established their right to be consulted about policies that affected their lives. This was a fundamental shift from previous approaches that treated children as objects of adult decision-making rather than participants in democratic processes. Was this change genuinely positive for the children involved? The answer depends on whether you prioritize safety, economic opportunity, or personal autonomy, and different children had different priorities based on their individual circumstances and capabilities. From a safety perspective, the reforms clearly reduced the number of children who died or suffered permanent injury from dangerous working conditions. The most extreme forms of exploitation became illegal and somewhat less common, which was an unambiguous improvement. Children were less likely to die of smoke inhalation, industrial accidents, or diseases contracted from exposure to toxic substances. From an economic perspective, the results were more mixed. The most talented and well-connected children often found opportunities for advancement that wouldn't have existed under the old system. But many others found their economic opportunities reduced without adequate alternatives being provided. The reforms created a cleaner distinction between legitimate and illegitimate forms of child labor. But they didn't address the underlying poverty that made such labor economically necessary for thousands of families. The question of personal autonomy was most complex. The street children had developed extraordinary levels of independence and self-determination under the old system, but they'd also lived with constant danger and uncertainty. The new regulations provided more security, but less freedom, more protection, but fewer opportunities for the kind of entrepreneurial innovation that had made some children remarkably successful. Different perspectives on these changes reflected different values and priorities. Child welfare reformers celebrated the reduced mortality rates and improved safety standards, while some economists worried about the disruption to established labor markets. The children themselves had divided opinions. Those who'd been most successful under the old system sometimes resented the new restrictions, while those who'd struggled with dangerous working conditions welcomed the additional protections. The short-term effects were clearly beneficial for public health and social stability, but the long-term consequences were more ambiguous. The reforms had established important precedents for government regulation of working conditions and recognition of children's rights, but they'd also created new forms of institutional control that limited some of the creative problem-solving that had made the street children's economy so innovative. Modern judgment tends to view these changes as obviously positive progress toward more humane treatment of children, but contemporary observers were more divided. Some worried that protecting children from economic exploitation might also eliminate valuable opportunities for practical education and character development. Others argued that the reforms didn't go far enough in addressing the underlying social conditions that created child homelessness and poverty in the first place. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that the changes represented a necessary but incomplete step toward recognizing children as full human beings with rights and agency, rather than property or social problems. The street children had forced Victorian society to confront contradictions in its values and practices. But the solutions that emerged were compromises that reflected the limitations of adult imagination and than the full scope of what the children had proven was possible. In the years following the Chimney Sweepers Act, the street children of Victorian London discovered that legal protection was like getting a fancy umbrella that only worked when it wasn't raining, theoretically helpful, but practically limited when you needed it most. The new regulations had created a strange hybrid system where children were simultaneously more protected and more vulnerable, more visible to authorities and more likely to be arrested for activities that had previously been ignored. The immediate aftermath revealed that Victorian society had been far more dependent on child labor than anyone wanted to admit. Industries that had relied on children's small size, agility, and willingness to work for minimal wages suddenly faced labor shortages that couldn't be easily solved by hiring adults. The result wasn't improved conditions for all children. It was the development of more sophisticated methods for exploiting child workers while technically complying with new legal requirements. Some employers responded by relocating their operations to rural areas where enforcement was sporadic, while others developed new forms of apprenticeship programs that provided legal cover for continued exploitation. The most creative employers discovered that they could hire children as consultants or advisors rather than direct employees, which allowed them to access children's specialized knowledge while avoiding responsibility for their safety or welfare. The children themselves adapted with the same creativity they'd always shown, but now they had to navigate an additional layer of bureaucratic complexity that made their survival strategies more complicated without necessarily making them more effective. Former climbing boys became safety inspectors and technical advisors, but they earned less money and had less autonomy than they'd enjoy as independent operators. Crossing sweepers found their territories regulated by municipal authorities who had no understanding of the economic relationships that made their services valuable. Perhaps most ironically, the legal protections that were supposed to help children often made their lives more difficult by criminalizing survival strategies that had previously been tolerated. A mudlark who'd been ignored while searching for valuable debris in the Thames could now be arrested for trespassing or theft, even if they were doing exactly the same work they'd always done. The new laws had created a category of illegal child labor that transformed previously legitimate economic activities into criminal behavior. The unintended consequences were often more significant than the intended benefits. Children who could no longer work in regulated industries didn't disappear. They moved into unregulated activities that were often more dangerous and always less visible to potential helpers. The reforms had pushed child labor underground rather than eliminating it, which made it harder to monitor and regulate, but no less necessary for a family survival in poor communities. Meanwhile, the success of Pete's cooperative model had inspired similar experiments throughout London, but scaling up these innovations proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. What worked for a small group of climbing boys with exceptional leadership and strong community connections didn't necessarily translate to larger populations of children with more diverse needs and capabilities. The changing landscape of child labor and social reform created opportunities for new types of adult involvement in street children's lives. But these new players brought their own agendas, limitations, and unintended consequences. The most significant new presence was the emergence of professional social workers, who represented society's first systematic attempt to apply scientific principles to the problem of child welfare. Dr. Margaret Whitmore was typical of this new breed of reformer, university-educated, well-intentioned, and completely unprepared for the reality of dealing with children who'd been running their own economic enterprises since they were old enough to walk. Dr. Whitmore arrived at the Thames foreshore with detailed theories about child development and moral education, only to discover that the mudlarks knew more about practical psychology than she'd learned in years of formal study. Dr. Whitmore's approach was to establish rational recreation programs that would provide street children with structured activities designed to develop proper moral character and useful work skills. She created workshops where former mudlarks could learn carpentry, former crossing sweepers could practice penmanship, and former climbing boys could study basic mathematics. The children attended these programs politely, learned whatever seemed useful, and then returned to their established survival strategies, because Dr. Whitmore's alternatives didn't pay enough to keep them alive. More successful were entrepreneurs, like Thomas Hartwell, who'd recognized that the street children possessed valuable skills that could be applied to legitimate business enterprises. Hartwell established a messenger service that employed former street children as guides and couriers throughout London, taking advantage of their detailed knowledge of the city's geography and their ability to navigate efficiently through crowded streets. Hartwell's innovation was treating the children as skilled workers rather than charity cases. He paid competitive wages, provided basic safety equipment, and allowed his employees to use their established networks and customer relationships to expand the business. The result was a profitable enterprise that provided steady employment for dozens of former street children while offering services that legitimate businesses genuinely needed. The most interesting new player was Inspector William Davies of the Metropolitan Police, who'd been assigned to enforce the new child labour regulations, but had quickly realised that traditional law enforcement methods were completely inadequate for dealing with street children who understood the city better than most police officers, and had support networks that could make them nearly impossible to locate when they didn't want to be found. Davies developed what he called collaborative policing, working with former street children as unofficial consultants who could help him understand how the underground economy actually functioned and what kinds of interventions might be effective. Instead of simply arresting children for illegal activities, Davies tried to connect them with legitimate alternatives that could provide similar economic opportunities without the legal risks. Davies' approach was controversial among his colleagues, who argued that negotiating with child criminals undermined police authority, but Davies had discovered that the street children were valuable sources of information about adult criminal activities, and their cooperation could help solve cases that traditional investigative methods couldn't crack. His files contained detailed intelligence about theft rings, illegal gambling operations, and various other criminal enterprises that had been invisible to conventional law enforcement. These new players represented different approaches to the problem of street children, but they all shared the limitation of trying to fit the children into existing institutional frameworks, rather than adapting those frameworks to accommodate the children's demonstrated capabilities and established social networks. Despite legal reforms and increased attention from well-meaning adults, fundamental problems persisted that proved remarkably resistant to conventional solutions. The most obvious continuing challenge was that thousands of children still had no reliable access to food, shelter, or safety, regardless of what laws said about their working conditions. Creating legal protections for child workers didn't eliminate the economic desperation that made such work necessary in the first place. The housing crisis that had created street children in the first place actually worsened during this period as London's population continued to grow faster than available housing. Families that had been barely managing to house their children found themselves unable to afford even the most basic accommodations, which meant that new children were constantly joining the street population even as others found ways to transition into more stable situations. What proved particularly intractable was the mismatch between the skills street children had developed and the requirements of legitimate employment opportunities. Children who'd mastered complex customer service, territory management, and strategic planning while mudlarking or crossing sweeping found themselves considered unskilled labourers by employers who valued formal education over practical experience. The result was that many highly capable children were offered only the most basic, lowest-paying jobs that didn't utilise their actual competencies. The institutional responses to street children remained fragmented and often counterproductive. Workhouses, religious charities, and government agencies each had their own approaches to child welfare, but these institutions rarely coordinated their efforts and sometimes worked at cross purposes. A child might receive food from one organisation, housing assistance from another, and employment training from a third, but nobody was responsible for ensuring that these services actually combined into a coherent plan for helping the child achieve long-term stability. Perhaps most frustrating was the persistence of what the children called reform theatre, well-publicized programs that were designed more to make donors feel good about helping than to actually address the children's real needs. Religious organizations would organize highly visible feeding programs that provided one meal while ignoring the fact that recipients had no place to sleep. Wealthy philanthropists would fund educational programs that taught skills for jobs that didn't exist or didn't pay enough to support independent living. The cyclical nature of these problems became increasingly apparent as the children who'd been successfully reformed during the 1860s had children of their own during the 1880s. Many former street children had managed to achieve marginal economic stability, but they remained vulnerable to any economic disruption that could push their families back into the conditions that had created street homelessness in the previous generation. New versions of old problems emerged as the economy evolved. While traditional mudlarking declined as the Thames became more heavily regulated, children found new forms of salvage work in industrial areas that were often more dangerous than the riverfront had been. While chimney sweeping became more regulated, children moved into other forms of hazardous employment that weren't covered by existing safety laws. The fundamental issue was that Victorian society had created economic and social conditions that required child labour for family survival, but then tried to solve the problem by regulating the labour rather than addressing the underlying conditions. The result was a constant cycle where reforms eliminated some forms of exploitation only to see them replaced by new forms that were harder to detect and regulate. The children's own networks and mutual support systems remain their most reliable source of assistance, but these informal systems were constantly disrupted by well-meaning interventions that didn't understand how they functioned or why they'd been necessary in the first place. Compared to earlier periods in London's history, the late Victorian approach to street children represented both significant progress and persistent limitations that revealed fundamental contradictions in how society thought about childhood, poverty, and social responsibility. The medieval approach had been essentially to ignore street children entirely, unless they became problems for property owners, while the early industrial period had treated them as convenient sources of very cheap labour without any consideration for their welfare or development. The Victorian reforms of the 1860s and beyond represented the first systematic attempt to balance economic utility with humanitarian concerns. But the solutions that emerged reflected the limitations of adult imagination more than the full scope of what the children had proven was possible. Earlier generations of street children had been completely invisible to official record keeping, while Victorian street children became the subjects of extensive documentation that often revealed more about adult anxieties than about children's actual experiences. What was unique about the Victorian period was the children's own level of organization and political consciousness. Street children in earlier eras had developed survival strategies, but they hadn't created the kind of coordinated resistance movements that characterized Pete's Rebellion and its aftermath. The Victorian street children had accidentally discovered principles of community organizing and collective action that influenced later social movements in ways that historians are still documenting. Compared to other places during the same time period, London's street children were remarkably sophisticated in their approaches to urban survival. Street children in Paris, Berlin, or New York faced similar challenges, but didn't develop the same level of systematic cooperation and strategic thinking that characterized London's underground economy. This might have been due to London's particular combination of economic opportunity, legal ambiguity, and social reform activism that created conditions favorable to children's organizational efforts. The lessons that could be learned from the Victorian street children's experiences were largely ignored by contemporary observers who were more interested in confirming their existing theories about childhood and social reform than in learning from the children's demonstrated competencies. Modern social workers and child welfare experts would recognize many of the children's innovations as sophisticated examples of peer education, mutual aid networks, and community-based solutions to systemic problems. The patterns that repeated elsewhere included the tendency for adult-designed solutions to focus on regulating symptoms rather than addressing underlying causes, the persistent gap between reformers' intentions and practical outcomes, and the remarkable capacity of children to adapt creatively to changing circumstances when given opportunities to do so. Perhaps most importantly, the Victorian street children's experience demonstrated that intelligence, creativity, and leadership aren't distributed according to social class or educational opportunity. They're universal human capacities that emerge whenever people face challenges requiring innovative solutions. This lesson was lost on most contemporary observers, but remains relevant for anyone trying to understand how to create effective responses to child homelessness and poverty. By the 1880s, signs pointed to the end of the golden age of Victorian street children's autonomous economy. Though nobody at the time understood, they were watching the collapse of one of history's most successful experiments in child-operated urban infrastructure. The warning signs were everywhere, but they looked like progress to most adult observers who had never understood what they were actually observing in the first place. The most obvious indication was the increasing efficiency of law enforcement and social services, which sounds like good news until you realize that efficiency in this context meant the systematic elimination of the legal gray areas where street children had built their economic empires. Police forces were becoming more professional, which meant they had less tolerance for the kind of creative entrepreneurship that had allowed crossing sweepers to manage pedestrian traffic and mudlarks to operate riverside salvage operations. Social reform organizations were becoming more systematic and bureaucratic, which meant they were better at providing consistent services, but worse at adapting to the specific needs and capabilities of individual children. The informal, relationship-based assistance networks that had emerged during the earlier period were being replaced by formal programs with standardized procedures that treated all children as essentially identical problems requiring identical solutions. What the adult reformers couldn't see was that their improvements in child welfare were actually destroying sophisticated social and economic systems that had taken decades to develop. When authorities established official, crossing sweeping services, they eliminated the territorial agreements and customer relationships that had made individual children's businesses profitable. When they regulated mudlarking in the name of safety, they destroyed knowledge networks that had taken generations to develop. The children themselves could see what was happening, but they had limited ability to resist changes that were being implemented in their name by adults who genuinely believed they were helping. The most perceptive street children began adapting their strategies to work within the new regulatory environment, but this required abandoning any of the innovations that had made their previous systems so effective. Economic changes were also undermining the foundations of the street children's economy. London's infrastructure was improving, which reduced demand for many of the services the children had been providing. Better street maintenance meant less need for crossing sweepers. Improved waste management reduced opportunities for valuable salvaging, and new technologies were replacing some of the specialized knowledge that had made children valuable employees in certain industries. The most successful form of street children had achieved enough economic stability to move away from the areas where they'd grown up, which meant the informal mentorship and knowledge transfer systems that had maintained the street children's culture were being disrupted. The children who remained on the streets were increasingly those who lacked the connections, skills, or opportunities that had allowed earlier generations to develop sophisticated survival strategies. Perhaps most significantly, the very success of the street children's organizing efforts had created expectations for government intervention that made their autonomous systems seem unnecessary. Why should children organize their own mutual aid networks when charitable organizations were promising to provide professional services? Why should they develop their own economic enterprises when reformers were offering legitimate employment opportunities? The end came not with dramatic confrontations or sudden policy changes, but through the slow strangulation of 1,000 small regulatory improvements that each seemed reasonable in isolation, but collectively eliminated the conditions that had made the street children's underground economy possible. The final blow was the Education Act of 1880, which made school attendance compulsory for children under 13 and created truancy officers whose job was to ensure that no child was engaged in economic activity during school hours. The legislation was presented as a victory for child welfare and universal education, and in many ways it was. But it also meant that the complex daytime economy that street children had developed over decades became illegal overnight. The mudlarks who had worked the Thames during low tide, the crossing sweepers who had managed morning pedestrian traffic, and the flower sellers who had positioned themselves outside shops during business hours were all suddenly criminals if they continued their established practices. The implementation of compulsory education revealed just how dependent London's informal economy had become on child labour and expertise. Adult crossing sweepers couldn't match the efficiency in customer service that children had provided, partly because they lacked the detailed knowledge of pedestrian patterns and customer preferences that children had developed, but mostly because they couldn't convincingly project the combination of competence and vulnerability that had made the children's services so appealing to wealthy customers. The Thames foreshore became quieter as mudlarking was restricted to after-school hours, but this meant that the most profitable searching times coincided with darkness, when the work became significantly more dangerous. Many former mudlarks simply abandoned the occupation rather than risking nighttime accidents, while others moved to less regulated riverside areas where the salvaging opportunities were fewer, but the interference was minimal. Sooty Pete, now in his 20s and operating a legitimate chimney cleaning business, attempted to preserve some of the street children's innovations by establishing an evening school where former street children could teach practical urban survival skills to younger children who were now required to spend their days in regular classrooms. But the authorities shut down his program after determining that teaching children about territory management and customer psychology wasn't an appropriate educational activity. The most dramatic final confrontation occurred when Inspector Davies, who had spent years developing collaborative relationships with street children, was ordered to arrest former allies who continued operating informal businesses after school hours. Davies had become the primary liaison between law enforcement and the street children's community, but the new regulations left no room for the kind of flexible enforcement that had allowed both sides to coexist peacefully. The symbolic endpoint came during the winter of 1881, when the last of the traditional Sunday markets, the informal gatherings where street children had traded goods, services, and information, was broken up by police who confiscated the children's merchandise and arrested several former leaders for corrupting minors by teaching younger children skills that were now considered inappropriate for their age group. The children didn't disappear, of course. They adapted once again, but their new strategies were necessarily more individual and less visible than the collaborative systems they developed during the previous decades. Some found ways to continue their traditional occupations during the limited hours when they weren't required to be in school, while others developed completely new survival strategies that operated in the spaces that adult authority hadn't yet learned to regulate. But what ended was the golden age of child-operated economic enterprises that had accidentally created London's most efficient urban service sector. The informal networks, collaborative decision-making processes, and innovative customer service techniques that had emerged from the street children's community were replaced by adult-managed programs that were safer and more respectable, but considerably less creative and adaptable. The irony was that just as Victorian society was congratulating itself on finally solving the problem of street children, it was eliminating one of the most successful examples of democratic self-organization and practical problem-solving that the city had ever produced. The children had proven that given autonomy and minimal interference, they could create sophisticated systems for urban management, but the adult response to their success was to eliminate their autonomy in the name of protecting them. The end of Victorian London's street children economy wasn't the result of a single cause, but rather the convergence of multiple social, economic, and political changes that made the children's autonomous systems incompatible with evolving expectations about childhood, education, and social order. The most fundamental factor was the shift in Victorian thinking about what childhood should be, from a period of economic contribution to a period of preparation and protection. The internal problems that weaken the street children's systems were largely consequences of their own success, as the most capable children found opportunities to transition into legitimate employment or small business ownership. The knowledge and leadership that had maintained the informal networks were lost to upward mobility. The children who remained on the streets were increasingly those who lacked the social connections, intellectual capabilities, or economic opportunities that had made the previous generation's innovations possible. External pressures came from multiple directions simultaneously. Religious organizations wanted to eliminate what they saw as moral corruption among unsupervised children. Business interests wanted more predictable, uncontrollable labor relationships than the informal arrangements that had characterized child employment. Government officials wanted to demonstrate that British civilization was advancing beyond the kind of social conditions that required children to work for survival. The role of individual personalities versus historical forces created complex dynamics during this transition period. While leaders like Pete had clearly been crucial to developing the street children's organizational capabilities, the broader social and economic changes that ended their autonomous systems were largely independent of any individual decisions or actions. Even the most capable child leaders couldn't have resisted the combined pressure of compulsory education laws, improved law enforcement, and changing economic conditions. What could have been done differently reveals the limitations of both contemporary thinking and modern alternatives. The street children's systems had developed creative solutions to real urban problems, but they had also depended on child labor that involved significant risks and limitations. A more imaginative approach might have found ways to preserve the children's innovations while providing them with better protection and more opportunities for personal development. The question of inevitability versus contingency is particularly interesting in this case. Some form of regulation and formalization was probably inevitable as Victorian society developed more systematic approaches to urban management and child welfare, but the specific form that change took, essentially destroying the children's systems rather than learning from them, reflected choices rather than historical necessity. Modern child welfare experts would probably argue that any system that depended on children's economic labor for urban infrastructure was inherently problematic, regardless of how well organized or successful it might have been. But the Victorian street children had demonstrated capabilities for self-organization, democratic decision-making, and creative problem-solving that most modern educational systems struggle to develop in children who have far more advantages and resources. The broader historical significance was that the end of the street children's economy represented the elimination of one of the few spaces in Victorian society where children could exercise genuine autonomy and demonstrate their full capabilities. The improvements in child protection and education that replaced the old system were clearly beneficial in many ways, but they also represented a narrowing of possibilities for children's participation in society as independent agents, rather than passive recipients of adult guidance. The tragedy wasn't that dangerous child labor was eliminated, but that the remarkable social innovations that had emerged from the children's community were lost rather than preserved and adapted for safer circumstances. The immediate aftermath of the street children's economic collapse created a vacuum in London's urban services that took years to fill adequately, proving that the children had been providing genuinely essential functions rather than just amusing themselves with elaborate games. The crossing sweeping services that replaced the children's operations were less efficient, more expensive, and significantly less responsive to customer needs, partly because adult workers lacked the children's detailed knowledge of pedestrian patterns and customer preferences. The Thames foreshore salvage operations never fully recovered from the loss of the mudlark's expertise. Adult scavengers didn't have the same intuitive understanding of tidal patterns, debris distribution, and valuable item recognition that the children had developed through years of experience. The result was that more valuable materials were lost to the river, while the cleaning of the foreshore became a municipal responsibility that was performed less frequently and less thoroughly than the children had managed. Those who stepped into the vacuum were primarily government agencies and charitable organizations that provided more systematic but less personalized services than the children's informal networks had offered. Municipal crossing sweepers worked regular hours and followed standardized procedures, but they couldn't match the children's ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions or provide the kind of individual customer service that wealthy pedestrians had come to expect. The immediate legacy among the children themselves was more complex. Some of the former street children who'd achieved economic stability became advocates for more systematic approaches to child welfare, arguing that their own experiences proved that children needed adult protection and guidance rather than autonomous responsibility. Others remained convinced that the old system had provided better opportunities for personal development and economic advancement than the new programs offered. Contemporary reactions reflected the deep ambivalence that Victorian society felt about its treatment of children. Reformers celebrated the elimination of dangerous child labor and the expansion of educational opportunities, while some observers worried that society was losing valuable innovations and perhaps underestimating children's capabilities. Business leaders complained about increased costs and reduced service quality, while religious organizations praised the moral improvements they believed were resulting from better supervision of children. The most significant immediate impact was on the broader working-class community, which had depended on children's economic contributions for family survival. Compulsory education meant that working-class families lost income while gaining expenses, creating financial pressures that weren't adequately addressed by the social programs that replaced child labor. Many families found themselves worse off economically, even as their children gained access to formal education. The attempts at revival or continuation were largely unsuccessful because they couldn't recreate the specific conditions that had made the children's original systems effective. Adult supervised programs that tried to teach children entrepreneurship or practical urban skills lacked the autonomy and economic necessity that had motivated the children's original innovations. The result was that the forms could be preserved, but not the substance of what had made the street children's economy so remarkable. The legacy of Victorian London's street children shaped social policy, labor relations, and educational theory in ways that most people never ever recognize, largely because the children's innovations were so thoroughly absorbed into mainstream thinking that their origins became invisible. The collaborative organizing techniques that Pete and his fellow climbing boys had developed became standard practices in labor unions throughout Britain, though few union organizers knew they were adapting strategies originally created by 10-year-olds. The customer service innovations that crossing sweepers and flower sellers had pioneered, understanding individual customer preferences, building personal relationships, and adapting services to specific needs, became foundational principles of modern retail and hospitality industries. The idea that service workers should be trained to recognize different customer types and adjust their approach accordingly seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary when Victorian street children first discovered that wealthy pedestrians would pay premium prices for personalized attention. Later generations viewed the street children through increasingly romanticized lenses that obscured their actual achievements while emphasizing their victimization. By the early 20th century, the dominant narrative had shifted from recognizing the children as innovative problem solvers to portraying them as tragic examples of social neglect who had been rescued by progressive reforms. This reframing made it easier for adults to feel good about social progress, while avoiding uncomfortable questions about whether modern systems actually utilized children's capabilities more effectively than the apparently chaotic street economy had done. The myths that developed around the street children reflected adult anxieties more than historical reality. Popular literature began portraying them as either innocent victims corrupted by urban life or as naturally criminal children who needed adult supervision to develop proper moral character. Both narratives ignored the evidence that the children had created sophisticated ethical systems based on mutual support, honest dealing, and community responsibility that were often more functional than the moral instruction provided by official institutions. Academic historians largely ignored the street children's story for decades because it didn't fit established categories for understanding child development, economic history, or social movements. The children had created something that was simultaneously educational system, economic network, and political organization, but scholars trained to study these phenomena separately had difficulty recognizing or analyzing their integrated approach. When historians finally began serious study of the street children's economy during the mid-20th century, they discovered that many of the innovations they'd assumed were modern developments had actually been pioneered by Victorian orphans. The idea of peer education, community-based mutual aid networks, and democratic decision-making processes all had precedence in the informal systems that street children had developed to solve practical survival problems. The most important historical impact was probably the demonstration that children could be effective participants in democratic processes and economic enterprises when given appropriate opportunities and minimal interference. This lesson influenced later educational theorists who argued for more child-centered approaches to learning, though most never made the connection to the Victorian street children's experiences. The children's innovations also provided models for a community organizing that influenced social movements throughout the 20th century. The techniques they developed for building solidarity across different groups, sharing resources efficiently, and coordinating collective action were remarkably similar to methods that civil rights organizers, labor unions, and community development programs would later adopt as best practices. Perhaps most significantly, the street children had proven that intelligence, creativity, and leadership weren't distributed according to social class or educational opportunity, but the broader implications of this discovery were largely ignored by a society that preferred to believe that social hierarchies reflected natural differences in capability rather than differences in opportunity and circumstances. Today, we can see echoes of Victorian street children's innovations in everything from gig economy platforms to community organizing strategies, though the connections are rarely recognized because we've forgotten how much of our modern urban infrastructure was originally developed by children who were just trying to stay alive. The ride-sharing and food delivery services that dominate urban transportation operate on principles that crossing sweepers pioneered: understanding traffic patterns, building customer relationships, and coordinating territory management among independent operators. Modern sharing economy platforms like Airbnb and TaskRabbit essentially formalize the kind of informal service networks that street children had created, except with smartphone apps instead of word-of-mouth communication, and corporate profit sharing instead of direct peer-to-peer assistance. The children had discovered that people would pay for convenience, reliability, and personalized service, and they developed systems for connecting service providers with customers that maximized efficiency while maintaining quality standards. The community organizing techniques that modern social movements use, building coalitions across different groups, sharing resources and information, and coordinating collective action, are remarkably similar to methods that Victorian street children developed to manage their underground economy. The difference is that modern organizers have formal training in these techniques, while the children had to invent them from scratch based on practical necessity. What hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency for adults to underestimate children's capabilities while simultaneously depending on their labor and creativity. Modern child protection laws are more comprehensive than Victorian regulations, but we still struggle with the same fundamental tension between protecting children from exploitation and recognizing their potential for meaningful contribution to society. The patterns that persist in different contexts include the gap between official policies and street-level reality, the tendency for well-intentioned reforms to create unintended consequences, and the remarkable capacity of marginalized populations to develop creative solutions to systemic problems when given minimal interference. Contemporary homeless services, for example, often struggle with the same challenges that Victorian reformers faced: how to provide assistance that actually helps, rather than creating new forms of dependency or control. Modern examples of similar innovation include the informal economies that develop in refugee camps, the peer education networks that emerge in underserved communities, and the creative survival strategies that homeless youth develop in contemporary cities. In each case, people facing extreme challenges create sophisticated systems for mutual support and resource sharing that often work more effectively than official programs designed to help them. The technology changes, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Street children in contemporary cities like Sao Paulo, Mumbai, or Los Angeles develop territory management systems, information networks, and customer service techniques that would be immediately recognizable to Victorian mudlarks or crossing sweepers. They understand urban geography, economic relationships, and social dynamics in ways that most adults never learn, simply because their survival depends on getting these things right. The lessons for contemporary issues are particularly relevant for discussions about youth engagement, community development, and social services design. The Victorian street children had demonstrated that young people could be effective partners in addressing urban challenges rather than just problems to be solved by adult experts. Modern programs that involve youth in designing services for their own communities often discover the same innovations that street children had developed independently. Perhaps most importantly, the street children's experience suggests that many contemporary social problems persist not because we lack resources or knowledge to address them, but because we consistently underestimate the capabilities of the people most directly affected by these problems. The children had developed solutions to homelessness, unemployment, and social isolation that were more effective than most professional interventions, but these solutions were dismissed rather than studied because they came from the wrong sources. The parallels extend to current debates about education, where many of the same tensions exist between providing children with protection and structure versus allowing them opportunities for genuine autonomy and responsibility. The street children had received an education in practical problem solving, emotional intelligence, and social cooperation that most modern schools struggle to provide. But they'd gained this education through experiences that we would now consider unacceptably dangerous and exploitative. Even now, the Victorian street children's legacy influences academic study, popular culture, political discourse, and social movements in ways that most people don't recognize because the connections have become so thoroughly integrated into our assumptions about urban life, child development, and community organization. Academic research on child development increasingly recognizes that children are capable of sophisticated reasoning, strategic planning, and moral decision-making at much younger ages than previous theories had suggested. While researchers rarely cite Victorian street children as evidence for these capabilities, the children's documented achievements provide some of the clearest historical examples of young people successfully managing complex social and economic responsibilities. Popular culture continues to romanticize the street children's story in ways that emphasize their victimization while downplaying their agency and innovation. Movies, novels, and television shows about Victorian London typically portray street children as pathetic waifs waiting for adult rescue than as the capable entrepreneurs and community organizers they actually were. This romanticization makes it easier for contemporary audiences to feel sympathy for historical injustices while avoiding uncomfortable questions about current social policies. Political discourse around child welfare, education policy, and urban planning still reflects many of the same assumptions and contradictions that characterized Victorian approaches to street children. Contemporary debates about youth employment, educational requirements, and social services often involve the same fundamental tensions between protection and autonomy that the Victorian street children had navigated with remarkable success. Social movements continue to rediscover organizing techniques that the street children had pioneered, though usually without recognizing the historical precedents. Community organizers working on issues like housing justice, workers' rights, and racial equality use methods for building solidarity, sharing resources, and coordinating collective action that would be immediately familiar to Pete and his fellow climbing boys. Why people still care about the Victorian street children's story reflects both genuine admiration for their resilience and creativity, and ongoing frustration with contemporary institutions that seem less effective at solving urban problems than a bunch of orphans with no formal education or legal authority. Their example suggests that many of our current challenges persist not because they're inherently unsolvable, but because we've organized our institutions in ways that prevent the kind of creative collaboration and adaptive problem solving that the street children had demonstrated was possible. The continuing relevance of their story lies in what it reveals about human potential when people are given genuine responsibility for addressing problems that affect their own lives, rather than being treated as passive recipients of services designed by others who may not understand their actual needs and capabilities. Looking back across the decades of Victorian London's street children economy, we've seen the emergence and evolution of one of history's most remarkable experiments in child-operated urban infrastructure, a parallel society that developed its own systems of governance, economics, education, and mutual support, while operating under conditions that would challenge the survival skills of most adults. The key patterns that emerge from this journey reveal fundamental truths about human adaptability and organizational capacity that transcend the specific historical circumstances of Victorian London. The children who seemed most powerless and vulnerable actually possessed sophisticated understanding of urban geography, economic relationships, and social dynamics that enabled them to create effective solutions to problems that adult institutions couldn't or wouldn't address. From Sarah Thompson's strategic crime performances to Pete's chimney sweeper rebellion, from the Mudlark's Thames salvage operations to the crossing sweepers' traffic management systems, we've witnessed a continuous thread of innovation driven by necessity, but sustained by intelligence, creativity, and collaborative spirit. These weren't random survival strategies. They were systematic approaches to transforming impossible circumstances into manageable challenges through careful observation, strategic thinking, and coordinated action. The most surprising discoveries along this journey have been the sophistication of the children's organizational systems and the effectiveness of their democratic decision-making processes, rather than the chaotic struggle for individual survival that Victorian adults expected. The street children had created remarkably stable communities with their own forms of justice, resource distribution, and conflict resolution that often worked better than official institutions designed to serve similar functions. Perhaps most importantly, we've seen how adult efforts to help the children often destroyed the very innovations that had made their survival possible, not through malicious intent, but through failure to understand what they were actually observing. The reforms that eliminated dangerous child labor also eliminated opportunities for children to demonstrate capabilities that formal education systems struggled to develop under much safer and more comfortable circumstances. The evolution of understanding throughout this period reveals how social problems and solutions are often more complex than they appear to reformers working from theoretical frameworks rather than direct experience. The street children had developed practical solutions to urban challenges, but these solutions didn't fit the categories that adult experts used to analyze social problems, which meant they were invisible to people who should have been learning from them. Most striking has been the recognition that these children were performing essential urban services while simultaneously developing social technologies that influenced later movements for democratic participation, community organizing, and cooperative economics. They were accidentally pioneering approaches to urban planning, customer service, and collaborative problem solving that professional experts would later claim as new discoveries. The journey through their world has also revealed the persistent human tendency to underestimate the capabilities of marginalized populations while depending on their contributions to maintain systems that the supposedly more capable people couldn't manage effectively. The irony that society's most vulnerable members were also its most innovative problem solvers provides uncomfortable insights into how social hierarchies actually function versus how they're supposed to work. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've learned about these remarkable children and what their legacy means for understanding human potential under extraordinary circumstances. In the spring of 1883, a newspaper reporter named Charles Whitman decided to investigate what had happened to the famous street children whose stories had captured public attention. The reform debates of the 1860s and 1870s. Whitman tracked down Pete, now in his 30s and operating a successful chimney cleaning business that employed a dozen adult workers and maintained contracts with some of London's wealthiest neighborhoods. When Whitman asked Pete about his transition from street child to legitimate businessman, Pete's response revealed the complexity of what had been lost and gained through the social reforms that had supposedly rescued children like him. The thing is, Pete explained, back when we were on our own, we had to be smart about everything, reading people, understanding money, figuring out how things really worked. Now my workers show up, do their jobs, and go home. They're safer, and they earn steady wages. But they don't need to think the way we had to think. Pete had preserved some elements of the old street children's culture in his business practices. He paid his workers better than industry standards. He shared profits with employees who brought in new customers, and he maintained the kind of detailed customer service that had made the children's enterprises so successful. But he also acknowledged that something essential had been lost in the transition to legitimate business operations. We used to solve problems together, Pete continued. If someone had trouble, everyone would think about it until we figured out what to do. Now when there's a problem, people wait for me to solve it because I'm the boss. It's more efficient, maybe, but it's not as smart. Whitman's most revealing discovery was that Pete had been secretly meeting with other former street children for years, not for social reasons, but to maintain the kind of collaborative problem-solving network that had sustained them during their childhood. They would share business intelligence, coordinate responses to economic challenges, and provide mutual assistance during difficult periods, essentially continuing the Sunday market tradition under different circumstances. When Whitman asked why they maintained these connections, Pete's answer captured the essence of what made the street children's community so remarkable. We learned that we're smarter together than any of us is alone. Most people never learn that because they never have to. But once you know it, you can't unknow it. The most poignant moment in Whitman's investigation came when he asked Pete whether he would want his own children to experience the kind of childhood he'd had. Pete's thoughtful response revealed the impossible choice between safety and capability that had defined the entire era of street children's autonomous development. I want them to be safe, Pete said, but I also want them to know they can solve problems that adults can't solve, that they can take care of themselves and each other, that they don't have to wait for someone else to make their lives better. I don't know how to give them that without giving them everything else we had to deal with. This story encapsulates the central paradox of the Victorian street children's experience. They had developed extraordinary capabilities through circumstances that were simultaneously empowering and dangerous, creative and brutal, educational and exploitative. The reforms that eliminated the dangers also eliminated many of the opportunities for the kind of personal and social development that had made their achievements possible. As we reach the end of this journey through the hidden world of Victorian London street children, perhaps the most important lesson isn't about the past, but about the present, about recognizing the remarkable capabilities that emerge when people are given genuine responsibility for solving problems that affect their own lives. These children proved that intelligence, creativity, and collaborative spirit aren't distributed according to social advantage, but are universal human capacities that flourish when circumstances require them, and wither when institutions make them unnecessary. Their story reminds us that the most innovative solutions to social challenges often come from the people who are most directly affected by those challenges, if we're willing to listen and learn, rather than simply trying to help. In the gentle darkness of London's modern streets, where crossing sweepers have been replaced by municipal services, and the Thames foreshore is managed by environmental agencies, the spirit of those remarkable children lives on in every act of creative problem-solving, every moment of mutual aid, and every time someone discovers that cooperation can achieve what individual effort cannot. The children who turn survival into an art form have left us with a simple but profound message. Given the opportunity, people can be far more capable than anyone expects, including themselves. Their legacy whispers through the night air of every city, where ordinary people are quietly doing extraordinary things, proving again and again that human potential is limited more by imagination than by circumstance. Rest well, knowing that somewhere, someone is discovering what those children knew. That intelligence and determination can transform even the most impossible situations into opportunities for innovation, community, and hope. The crossing sweepers may be gone, but the crossings they maintained between possibility and reality remain open for anyone brave enough to step across them.